Marcus stepped out of the elevator, his mind already drifting toward the comfort of home after a long day at work. The sleek marble floors and polished chrome fixtures of the apartment building lobby greeted him as usual, but something felt off today. A woman middle-aged, with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stood near the entrance, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her gaze locked onto Marcus the moment he appeared, narrowing slightly as if sizing him up. "Excuse me," she called out before he could even reach for the door to his unit. Her voice carried a tone that was equal parts suspicion and hostility. "You're not supposed to be here, are you?" Marcus paused mid-step, taken aback by the abruptness of the question. He turned to face her, forcing a polite smile, despite the growing unease in his chest. "I live here," he replied calmly, though the weight of her scrutiny pressed down on him like an invisible force. The woman tilted her head, her expression unyielding. "Oh, really? Someone dressed like that lives in this building?" She gestured vaguely toward his attire, simple t-shirt and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. But her words carried an unmistakable edge, dripping with prejudice and assumption. For a brief moment, Marcus considered letting it slide. After all, arguing with strangers wasn't exactly how he wanted to spend his evening. Yet something about her dismissive tone ignited a spark of defiance within him. He straightened his posture, meeting her gaze squarely. "Yes, I live here. Apartment 5B. Her lips curled into a sneer, clearly unconvinced. "Prove it!" she shot back, her voice laced with challenge. "What's your name? How much do you pay for rent? Do you even have keys?" Every word stung, not because of their content, but because of the underlying implication that someone who looked like Marcus couldn't possibly belong in such a place. His patience began to fray, replaced by a simmering anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. Still, he forced himself to stay composed, knowing escalation would only play into her hands. "My name is Marcus," he said firmly, pulling his keys from his pocket and holding them up for her to see. "And yes, these are my keys. As for rent, why does that matter? If I live here, I live here." But Clarethe, a woman, revealed herself through casual mentions during later conversations, wasn't satisfied. Instead of backing down, her accusations grew more aggressive. "Keys can be faked," she retorted, her voice rising slightly. "And people like you don't just walk into buildings like this without raising questions. Are you sure you're not trying to break in?" The absurdity of her claim hung heavy in the air, drawing stares from other residents lingering nearby. Some avoided eye contact, uncomfortable yet unwilling to intervene. Others exchanged whispers, their body language hinting at agreement with Claire's stance. Marcus noticed it all, the subtle nods, the averted gazes, but refused to let it deter him. "I'm telling you, I live here," he repeated, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "If you want proof, fine. But don't assume things based on how I look." As the standoff continued, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Tension crackled between them like static electricity, drawing in those around them. One neighbor, a young man clutching a takeaway coffee cup, hesitated near the elevators, torn between curiosity and discomfort. Another, an older woman walking her dog, lingered closer than necessary, clearly eavesdropping. Claire, however, remained undeterred. Her accusations morphed into broader assumptions, painting Marcus as a threat to the safety of the building. "You probably deal drugs or something," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him and anyone else listening to hear. The comment hit hard, striking a nerve that sent a wave of indignation coursing through Marcus. For a split second, he considered walking away, ignoring her altogether. But then he remembered why moments like this mattered, why standing up against ignorance and bias was crucial, even when it meant facing hostility head-on. So instead of turning away, Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording. "This conversation is getting ridiculous," he said coolly, holding the device up so she could see it clearly. "Maybe we should both calm down and think about what's actually happening here." Her reaction was instantaneous and predictable. "Are you threatening me now?" she snapped, taking a step closer. "Don't think you can intimidate me with your little tricks." At that precise moment, the security guard emerged from the corner office, drawn by the commotion. What happened next would change everything for Marcus, for Claire, and for everyone involved. The arrival of the security guard shifted the dynamics of the confrontation immediately. Dressed in a crisp uniform, the guard whose name tag read Steve approached with an air of authority that seemed misplaced given the situation. Claire wasted no time explaining her side of the story, her voice rising as she recounted Marcus's supposed intrusion. "He claims he lives here," she said, gesturing dramatically toward Marcus. "But honestly, does someone like that really belong in this building? I mean, look at him. He's probably trying to bring drugs inside or something." Steve glanced at Marcus briefly, his expression unreadable. Instead of addressing the obvious racial undertones in Claire's words, he focused on protocol. "Sir, can you prove you live here?" he asked, directing his question to Marcus with a neutral tone that masked any personal bias or lack thereof. Marcus nodded slowly, already prepared for this moment. From his pocket, he produced his lease agreement, neatly folded and tucked away earlier that morning in anticipation of situations like this. Alongside it, he pulled out utility bills and other documents confirming his residency. Each piece of evidence was presented calmly, methodically, leaving little room for doubt. "I've lived here for over 2 years," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "All these papers should confirm that." Steve scanned the documents quickly, nodding once before handing them back. But instead of dismissing Claire's accusations outright, he turned to her with a placating smile. "Ma'am, everything checks out. This gentleman is indeed a resident of the building." Claire's face flushed red, her initial confidence faltering under the weight of reality. For a brief moment, silence filled the lobby as both parties processed the revelation. Then, without missing a beat, Claire pivoted to another line of attack. "But what if he's lying?" she pressed, her voice tinged with desperation now. "What if he stole those documents too? You can't just trust anyone these days." Steve hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Claire as though weighing their credibility. The delay only added fuel to Marcus's growing irritation. Before he could respond, however, another voice cut through the tension. "Drew!" called out one of the bystanders, pointing toward a middle-aged man emerging from the elevator. Drew, a longtime resident known for his friendly demeanor and deep ties to the community, recognized Marcus instantly. "Marcus lives here," Drew confirmed firmly, stepping closer to reinforce his statement. "He's been a great neighbor since moving in. There's absolutely no reason to question him." Claire's eyes widened, clearly thrown off balance by Drew's intervention. She opened her mouth to argue further, but Steve intervened before she could speak. "If there's nothing else, ma'am, I suggest we let Mr. Thompson go." "Evening," he said diplomatically, using Marcus's last name for added formality. Fuming but unable to push further without appearing unreasonable, Claire backed down reluctantly. "Fine," she muttered, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "But don't think this is over. Someone needs to keep an eye on people like him." Her parting shot hung heavy in the air, leaving Marcus seething even as he retreated to the safety of his apartment. Behind him, murmurs rippled through the crowd of onlookers, some expressing sympathy while others remained silent, unsure how to react. Once inside, Marcus slumped onto his couch, exhaustion washing over him despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The incident had been infuriating, yes, but it also served as a grim reminder of the systemic biases embedded in everyday life. How many times had he faced similar judgments simply because of the color of his skin? And how many more would he endure before society learned to see past superficial differences? As the evening wore on, Marcus replayed the events in his mind, searching for answers he knew wouldn't come easily. Why did people like Claire feel entitled to judge others based on appearance alone? Why did systems designed to protect residents often fail when confronted with prejudice? Most importantly, how could he turn this frustrating encounter into something meaningful, something capable of sparking change? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it revealed Drew standing on the other side, holding a small envelope. "Thought you might need this," Drew said, handing it over with a warm smile. Inside was a note containing contact information for local organizations fighting against housing discrimination, along with a message of support. "You're not alone in this fight," Drew added, his tone sincere. "And if there's anything I can do to help, you know where to find me." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. While the battle against ignorance and bias wouldn't end anytime soon, moments like this reminded him that allies existed, even in unexpected places. Together, they could create a future where stories like his became less common, less necessary. The next morning, Marcus awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Sleep still fogging his mind, he reached for it and saw dozens of notifications flooding in texts, emails, social media alerts, all pointing to one thing. The video of yesterday's confrontation had gone viral overnight. At first, Marcus felt a mix of disbelief and dread. He hadn't intended for the recording to reach such a wide audience. He'd simply wanted documentation in case things escalated further. But now, clips of the exchange were circulating across platforms, sparking heated debates about race, privilege, and systemic bias. Some comments praised him for staying calm under pressure, while others attacked Claire viciously, calling her out as a symbol of unchecked racism. A few even directed vitriol toward the building management, accusing them of fostering an environment where such behavior could thrive. As Marcus scrolled through the chaos unfolding online, his initial shock gave way to unease. While part of him was relieved that the truth had come to light, another part braced for the backlash. Sure enough, hate mail began trickling in alongside messages of support, each one more venomous than the last. One email accused him of fabricating the entire incident for attention. Another claimed he was exploiting racial tensions for personal gain. The sheer volume of negativity made it hard to focus on anything else. Meanwhile, the story gained traction beyond social media. Local news outlets picked up the thread, reaching out to Marcus for interviews. At first, he hesitated, unsure if engaging with the press would do more harm than good. But after consulting Drew, who urged him to use the platform to advocate for broader change, he agreed to speak publicly about his experience. In front of cameras, Marcus recounted the events of the previous evening with clarity and composure. He emphasized the need for accountability not just for Claire, but for institutions that enable discriminatory behavior. "This isn't about one bad apple," he said during one interview. "It's about recognizing the systems that allow people like her to act without consequence." His words resonated deeply, prompting calls for action from community leaders and activists alike. Within days, the apartment management announced plans to implement mandatory anti-bias training for all staff members, including security personnel. They also pledged to establish clearer protocols for handling disputes between residents, ensuring future incidents wouldn't escalate, as they had in Marcus's case. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Some residents pushed back against what they perceived as unnecessary overreach, arguing that singling out individuals based on race created division rather than unity. Online forums erupted into fiery debates, with some defending Claire's right to question strangers in her building and others condemning her actions outright. Even among those who supported Marcus, opinions varied widely on how best to address the root causes of discrimination. Amidst the turmoil, Claire herself became a focal point of public scrutiny. Initially defiant, she doubled down on her original claims, dismissing criticism as politically motivated attacks. In interviews with local reporters, she portrayed herself as a victim of reverse racism, claiming Marcus had used his identity as a weapon to discredit her. Her statements drew both outrage and sympathy, depending on who you asked. For Marcus, navigating this whirlwind proved exhausting, yet enlightening. As he engaged with allies and adversaries alike, he realized the power of storytelling in driving social change. Every share, every comment, every conversation sparked by his experience brought attention to issues often ignored or dismissed. Yet he also understood the toll it took. Toxic comments lingered long after being deleted, and the weight of representing an entire cause sometimes felt overwhelming. To cope, Marcus leaned heavily on his growing network of supporters. Drew continued to offer guidance, connecting him with organizations specializing in housing rights and racial justice. Through them, Marcus discovered opportunities to channel his frustration into meaningful action, whether by speaking at town halls or participating in advocacy campaigns. Slowly, but surely, he transformed from a reluctant participant into a committed activist. Behind the scenes, however, tension simmered within the building itself. Not all residents embraced the new initiatives proposed by management. Some viewed them as token gestures meant to placate angry mobs, while others worried about potential repercussions for voicing dissenting opinions. Cliques formed along ideological lines, deepening divisions that had always existed beneath the surface. One evening, as Marcus returned home from a particularly draining day of meetings, he encountered Claire in the elevator. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, her usual hostility replaced by something resembling discomfort. For the first time since their initial confrontation, neither spoke. When the doors opened, Marcus stepped out without a word, leaving her alone with whatever thoughts plagued her mind. The weeks following the viral incident brought a mix of progress and tension to Marcus's life. While the public outcry against Claire had led to significant changes in building policies, her presence remained a constant reminder of unresolved issues. Despite management's efforts to address systemic biases, Claire continued to act as though nothing had changed. Her behavior, though more subtle now, still carried an undercurrent of hostility that many residents noticed but chose not to confront. One evening, Marcus returned home from a community meeting where he'd spoken about the importance of allyship and accountability. Exhausted but hopeful, he stepped into the lobby, only to find Claire waiting near the mailboxes. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, and her expression betrayed no warmth or acknowledgement of his arrival. Before Marcus could pass by without incident, Claire spoke up, her voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, look who it is, the neighborhood celebrity," she sneered, loud enough for others in the vicinity to overhear. "I guess being on television makes you think you're better than everyone else now, huh?" Marcus stopped in his tracks, taken aback by her audacity. He had hoped that after everything that transpired, Claire might have learned some measure of humility. Clearly, he was mistaken. "I'm just trying to live my life here," Marcus replied calmly, though his jaw clenched slightly. "If you have a problem with me, maybe it's time to reflect on why." Her response came quickly, fueled by anger and defiance. "Don't lecture me about reflection, Mr. Perfect Resident. You don't know anything about what it's like to actually belong here." Her tone grew sharper, bordering on aggressive. "People like you come in, make waves, and expect us to roll out the red carpet because you've got a sob story." Several bystanders turned their attention toward the escalating exchange, uncomfortable yet unable to look away. Among them was Steve, the security guard, who hesitated before stepping forward cautiously. Before he could intervene, however, Claire took another step closer to Marcus, her voice rising further. "And let me tell you something else," she spat, her words laced with venom. "You may have won this round, but I'll never stop fighting for what's right for us." At that moment, another resident this time, an older woman named Margaret, stepped between them, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "That's enough, Claire," she declared firmly. "Your behavior is unacceptable, and frankly, it's embarrassing. We're all tired of your antics." Claire whirled around, her face flushed with rage. "Stay out of this, Margaret. You don't understand what's at stake." But Margaret stood firm, addressing Claire directly. "What's at stake is our community and how we treat each other. If you can't respect basic decency, then perhaps you shouldn't be part of this building anymore." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Steve finally intervened, placing himself squarely between Claire and Marcus. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said sternly. "If you continue making threats or causing disturbances, I'll have no choice but to call the police." For a brief moment, Claire seemed to consider backing down, but instead of retreating, she lunged forward, shoving past Steve and grabbing Marcus roughly by the arm. "You think you can ruin my reputation and get away with it?" she shouted, her grip tightening painfully. "Well, I'm done playing nice." The sudden escalation shocked everyone present. Marcus instinctively pulled away, But Claire refused to release him, her nails digging into his skin. Steve acted swiftly, pulling her off and restraining her while calling for backup. Within minutes, officers arrived on the scene, assessing the situation and separating the two parties. As they questioned Claire, her demeanor shifted from belligerent to defensive. She accused Marcus of provoking her, claiming he harassed her daily and made false accusations against her. However, multiple witnesses, including Margaret and several other residents, corroborated Marcus's account, painting a clear picture of Claire's aggression. The officers reviewed the evidence carefully, including footage from building cameras that captured the altercation. Based on witness testimonies and physical evidence, they arrested Claire on charges of assault and disorderly conduct. As she was led away in handcuffs, her protests fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the collective sigh of relief among the gathered residents. In the days that followed, the apartment management issued a formal statement, condemning Claire's actions and announcing her permanent eviction from the building. Legal proceedings moved swiftly, resulting in additional penalties for harassment and racial discrimination. Claire's refusal to accept responsibility sealed her fate, leaving her isolated and disgraced both within the community and beyond. For Marcus, the resolution brought mixed emotions. On one hand, justice had been served, and the toxic presence in his building had finally been removed. Yet he couldn't help but feel sympathy for the cycle of ignorance and hatred that drove people like Claire to act so destructively. It reinforced his belief that education and empathy were essential tools in dismantling such barriers. Months later, the atmosphere in the building had transformed dramatically. Residents organized regular events, promoting inclusivity and understanding, fostering connections that once seemed impossible. Drew and Margaret played key roles in these efforts, encouraging open dialogue and collaboration. Even Steve underwent training sessions aimed at improving cultural competence, vowing to uphold fairness in all future interactions. Though scars remained from the ordeal, Marcus emerged stronger and more determined than ever. He continued advocating for change, using his platform to highlight stories of resilience and hope. In doing so, he honored not only his own journey but also the countless others who faced similar battles every day. And as for Claire, her downfall served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that actions have consequences, and ignorance cannot hide behind privilege forever. Her name faded from headlines, replaced by new narratives, shaped by those committed to creating a better world.